Hello and welcome everyone to this week's episode of the podcast. It is wonderful to have you here. This week we're talking about 5 simple steps you can take to get press for your jewelry business. So I know that getting press for your business can feel like quite a daunting task, especially if you've never done it before. It's a whole another world of things to explore, but there does reach a certain stage in your business where you might think, actually, now's a really good time to try and get some press. And press is like a long-term strategy. So it helps to build your brand, it helps to build trust, it helps people to know you more, to understand you more. It's not a quick sales strategy. So it's really important that if you're investing some time and energy in doing press in your business, that you don't expect an immediate return on that. Like most things that we're doing, we're building over time and developing. But it can be really good. It can also be a massive confidence booster as a business owner to be featured in like a magazine or in like a really interesting blog that you've followed for ages and you really admire, or even to get shared on other people's social media, like digital press. There's lots of kind of benefits that come from press, and I've done quite a lot over the years. It's something that I've invested time and energy in at certain stages in my business, and at other times I haven't. So it's not something like social media where we try and keep consistent. It's more something that you might choose and say, okay, the next 6 months I'm going to focus a bit on getting some press, and then you might leave it for a couple of years and come back to it. And if you are quite an established business and you've been getting press for a while, you might look to hire someone to help you with press, like an external PR, and they can be brilliant if you're at that stage. They're quite expensive, so it's for more developed businesses, but there's loads that you can do yourself. And if you've never done any press before, hopefully this will help you get your thoughts in order and just follow these simple steps. And if you are doing press, hopefully this will be a bit of housekeeping for you guys to kind of think, okay, am I doing all these things? Are there any things that I could work on? So I'm hoping it's going to be really helpful for you today. And if you're listening to the podcast, do come and share with me on Instagram. I love seeing you guys listen to the podcast. So take a screenshot if you're listening on YouTube, or if you're listening on the apps, you can do the same and just say, let me know what you thought of it, and if you're going to be doing any press as a result of it. You can tag us at Jewellery Academy anytime. So step 1 of 5, the first thing that we want to do when we're starting a press strategy for our business is to make a list of the places we'd like to be featured, because press is such a broad term, especially if you include digital as well as printed press. So what do I mean by this? I mean, one of the most popular ones for jewelry businesses and jewelry teaching businesses is local magazines. So most of us where we live, we have 1 or sometimes 2 local magazines. I know where I used to live in London, we had a local magazine for our postcode, which would come through the door every month, which was like a small one. And then we'd have a larger one, which was for the whole of South London. So that one was a little bit more challenging to get into, but both of those are really good target audiences for me selling my jewelry and also teaching my jewelry classes. So local press can be really valuable, and it's not difficult to get into local press. So we definitely want those on there. And sometimes there are local newspapers as well, or local information papers. So anything that comes through your door, keep it, hold on to it, don't just throw it straight in the bin, because that could be a really useful resource for you to be able to get something printed. As well as the local press, there are things like the glossy women's magazines. I don't know if we're allowed to call them women's magazines anymore, but I think you know the ones that I mean, that are the monthly magazines that come out, and there are all different types of those. Everything from sort of fashion mags all the way through to like the home and country and all of those. So whenever we're thinking about press that we want to get into, we need to think about our ideal customer and what they might read and what their interest is. So for example, if you go shopping, I went shopping in Waitrose the other day, they have the Waitrose magazines and they have some other really lovely magazines in there. And I think, oh, my ideal customer might be in there. So we want to go to the places where our ideal customer would go and see what they're seeing, because they're the places that we want to target. So that's a really good place to start. And if you don't know much about your ideal customer, then it's going to be good to start with yourself. So where do you go? Are there any magazines that you read? I know it's not huge anymore, but I know for me, like I used to buy magazines and just kind of flick through them and throw them away. Whereas now when I buy them, I'm normally going on an airplane, or I've got a bit of time off, and I read them almost like a book. So I actually invest more time in them. But I read them less often. But when I do look at them, I'm much more interested in what the content is. So don't discount them. They still do matter. And like I said, it's not just the people reading it, it's also that you can do a screenshot and share that you've done it, so you can kind of build that awareness online as well. So they have a dual benefit there. So make this list of all the places, and we talked a bit about printed material, but of course there's loads of press that isn't printed. So bloggers, are there any websites or brands or bloggers that do regular features and you'd like to be featured? I mean, one example, a great example for jewelers is Craft. Craft is a wonderful jewelry supplies business, and they have an amazing blog and they interview jewelers. And if you've not checked it out, you definitely should. So those are the kind of places that are really targeted. So you could definitely contact them. Maybe don't all do it at once, but find the time that's right for you and your business, contact them and say, I'd love to be featured. And you never know, you might just be. Podcasts, for example, this very podcast we are on, we're always interviewing jewelers, so we could definitely go on your press list. If you were interested in being interviewed on the Jewelers Academy podcast, we should be added to that. And there may be other podcasts, there may be other blogs, so just a couple of examples. So this is all low-hanging fruit because they're people who are actively looking. We're always actively looking for jewelers who have a story to tell, or something that's happened with them and their business that would be interesting to the community. So we are actively looking, as are all these other places. So you're not bothering people when you're contacting them about it. They may not get back to you right away because that's how press works. It's, we're asking for things and sometimes they come back and sometimes you get ignored. But we're going to talk a bit about how you build into your strategy, how you can regularly contact people in a way that's helpful for them. So podcasts. Also put down any Instagram accounts or just anywhere that you would like to be featured. There's lots of things online where they do like handmade hours, or I think it was Theo Pathetis used to have the Small Business Sunday. I don't know if he still does, on Twitter, where he would share a small business each Sunday. So any of these kind of platforms where you would like to be mentioned. It might be somebody that you follow, it might be a coach, or it might be some kind of organization to do with handmade or to do with jewelry, or to do with something completely different. Then put them in there. And we want to have between about 10 and 20 of these on our list. And normally my rule of thumb is we want to make sure that around half of them feel very achievable. And then, up to half can be kind of big goals. Like, I'd like to be there someday, but it's a bit of a long shot. Like some of the glossy mags, it's a little bit more of a stretch to find it. You still can, and you can get lucky, but sometimes they have certain contacts, and that's where external press can help. Because when I worked with an external PR company, they knew the people, they knew the journalist in those magazines, so they would constantly be pitching stuff to them, and they would pitch their clients. So it's more tricky for people who don't have that representation to get into those. It doesn't mean that you can't, but we often start with that low-hanging fruit of like the blogs and the local press and all of those things. So first step, make that list. Second step is, once we have the list, we want to find the name or the contact of the person to contact, to get in touch with. So if possible, find the name and find their specific email, because we're coming up, we're going to be sending them some stuff. If you can't, then you can send it to a general email. That is absolutely fine. But if you can, dig a little bit deeper and try and find the actual contact of the person who manages the blog, or who does the marketing in that firm, or who the journalist who works on that feature. And a really good thing to do for magazines is to buy a copy or even a couple of copies of them and flick through and really kind of analyze them and think, okay, what regular features are they doing? My local magazine used to do like a featured business of the month. So that was such an easy pitch for me, because I knew that they had that every month. I knew it was a little interview style. So I could get in touch with them and say, I've seen this amazing feature you do every month. I think it's awesome. I'd love to be featured. Here's some information about my business. So when we contact journalists or whoever we're contacting who's responsible for this form of content, we want them to know that we know what they're doing and we know how their structure works. So we're not just saying, this is me, feature me. But we're saying, I've read what you're doing. I understand the structure of what you're trying to do, because they're trying to serve their audience. That's their primary goal, is who's their customer, who are they talking to, and what content can they create for them. So for example, with the Jewellers Academy podcast, our audience are jewelers, small business owners, people wanting to create a living out of doing something they love. So whenever anyone gets in touch about the podcast, I'm always thinking, what can we talk about that's going to be helpful for everyone? That's my goal. And that's the same with all of these people that you contact, is they want to have something interesting, something perhaps educational, or a story to be able to share with the people who engage with their organization. So keeping that in mind can really help. So analyze the blogs, analyze the magazines, analyze the places you want to be featured, and try and see, do they do any regular content that you can fit into, because they're going to be looking out for those. And buy a couple of copies if it's physical hard stuff. Or like I said, if it comes through the door, if it's a local newspaper, just keep a couple of those, flick through them and have a look. Where could your business fit in? What would it work with? Or if it's not, perhaps it's not a story about your business, perhaps you're positioned as an expert, perhaps it has like an expert feature of the month where it says, I know one of my local magazines has like financial tips each month. But and you could say tips about something topical. So we're going to come on to this in a little bit, but it's been the Queen's Jubilee recently. So I know a couple of press people got in touch with me about talking about the jewels that were involved. I didn't follow it up because we have so much going on, and you don't always have to do everything that comes to you, but there's ways to tie into what is topical, and that's kind of something that's going to come up in the next point as well. So what we want to do first is we've made this list of all these places we want to be featured. We've analysed them. Next, we've made a press mailing list. So we've got a mailing list of people who run these organisations or perhaps are responsible for the content, and they're the people we want to get in touch with. And of course, we'll never send an email to all of these people in one go. We'll never send something that's not personal, because we want to make sure that we have that direct contact and that we've explained. It's a bit like applying for a job. You wouldn't just send out your CV to all these different organizations. You would personalize it. So we're going to get onto that as well. But it's really useful for you and in your business as a business owner to have it all in one place. And what you can do with that press mailing list is keep it up to date. So if you've contacted people a few times, you've heard nothing back, then you might take that organizational person off the list, just so that we're not sort of spamming people with things. But if you get a response, then that's a relationship that you might begin to nurture for moving forwards with the press in your business. The next thing we want to do is think about content. So now we've got the people we're going to be sending our stuff to. What are we going to share with them? So we want to move forward to create a press release. But before we create a press release, it's a really good idea to brainstorm some topics for yourself in your business. And the way that I like to do this is have a kind of annual press theme, and you might choose like every other month that you'll send out a press release, or it could even be once a quarter. And once you've done this once for a year, you can literally use the same sort of template each year. So that's the great thing about press is, there's a lot of trends that are kind of annual, especially for the monthly magazines, which get printed quite far in advance. So you want to contact people, 3, sometimes 6 months before for features to come out at the right time. So we are now in July. moving to August soon, and so already they'll be looking at Christmas features and various things like that. So that's the monthly ones. The local magazines won't be quite as far advanced, but it's really important with print to think about those lead times. Blogging tends to be much quicker. Sometimes it's a week or two or a month at the most to be able to sort of get a blog out, and podcasting is probably similar as well, around a month lead time for most podcasters to be able to get some information out. But it's always good to give more time than less, so that you're not caught out if you're promoting for a special sort of deadline that is coming up. So stories and topics. How do we come up with stories and topics? Well, we want to think about the year. So when we used to do this at the London Jewellery School, we were teaching jewellery making classes, and we would often have, in January, we'd actually have a monthly one. So I'll talk you through some of those, but you can obviously tailor it for your particular business. So in January, we talk about, you know, the new year, new goals, new kind of direction, focusing on the things that you really love. And that was a really nice start to the year. And we talk about our classes and how that could help people reach those types of goals. Then February was all about Valentine's, and we'd often have Valentine's special events, special classes just for Valentine's. So if that was a jewelry business, you could talk about your Valentine's collection, especially if you've got something a little bit different, a little bit quirky, or something with a story behind it. Then kind of March, April was more into like wedding season. So we talk more about things to do with wedding jewelry and creating your own tiaras and making your wedding rings. But again, for a jewelry business, it could be, how does your jewelry relate to the wedding season? Or it could be something completely different. There's also Easter. So you want to think about what's happening in the world, out externally, and what events are coming up. And you've got obviously the summer through to autumn. September is like a new term, so often people are looking for new starts in September. Throughout the summer, it's a lot of beach themed, people are going on holiday, or people are having some time off. People are also off with their kids, so it's perhaps tying things into that as well. So you're kind of picking topics that relate to what is going on, and that's a really good starting point. Another thing that you can tie in with the press is the press always want to link your story to what's happening in the world, in the economy, in the news that people are talking about. So for example, when I started my business, I got a lot of press around the idea of being a young entrepreneur, because I started quite young and I dropped out of uni. And so there was a whole story there. And whilst I wasn't particularly interested in sharing that story, I mean, I was happy to share it, but my interest was jewelry and jewelry making and classes. But we needed to find an angle. With press, you want to find an angle. And that angle tied into what was happening at the time, that a lot of young people weren't sure about whether they were going to go to uni or not, with the rising cost of fees. The government brought in startup loans to help people start their own business instead of, you know, potentially going to uni if they didn't want to. So we got a lot of press and attention around that. So it's thinking about ways that you can tie in what you're doing to what's going on. For example, at the moment, what's going on in press is people are talking a lot about the rising cost of living, perhaps talking about how you're starting or growing a business alongside the rising cost of living struggles, how you've overcome them. COVID has obviously been in the press for ages, so talking about how you've launched a business in COVID, or how your business has pivoted, or, you know, anything linking into that could be topical. Or it could be something completely different, like we talked about before, the Queen's Jubilee, you know, something kind of light and fun and interesting. But thinking about, instead of from our perspective of, I've got this jewelry and I want a picture in that magazine of it so people buy it, which of course we want, is thinking, how can we make this an interesting story that is tying into what's happening, that's topical at the moment, and that leads people to us. So another thing that I've been doing more press about recently is burnout, and kind of how entrepreneurs struggle, particularly with this ties into COVID, and how a lot of people went through burnout in COVID. And kind of sharing experiences and journeys, and that press doesn't necessarily lead to anything in the short term. But it's all, I mean, I partly do that because I care about it. It's a topic I really care about, but also because it is building relationships with press. It's developing that muscle in your business to be able to do these things, the confidence to be able to be featured in different places. And you never know what it could lead to. There's this kind of snowball effect with press that once you get one piece, you start to get others. So it's one of those things, you never know what's going to quite happen on the journey, but it's really fun to explore and to put your business out there and to put yourself out there, because you can't hide when you're involved in press. It can't just be about your jewelry business. It needs to also be about you and your story and linking that in. And trade press is also something that shouldn't be ignored. So jewelry industry press. And we talked about that a little bit with like the Canon Craft blog, but there's other places out there like Bench Peg is a popular like newsletter website that talks about jewelry and jewelers. Professional Jeweler is another one. So there's all these sorts of places, the Guild of Jewelry Designers, that have blogs, that have newsletters, that have an audience that you can share information with. So that was point 3, coming up with stories and topics that you can write about. So we have made a list of places in point 1. We have put together a mailing list in point 2. Now we have some stories and some content that we can talk about. So number 4 is to write the press release, to actually write the press release. And don't overthink this one. It can seem, the term press release can seem really daunting, but all it is an article. And the ideal press release for the press is that they receive it and they copy it and they paste it into their magazine with the images you've put in there, and their job is done. That doesn't always happen. Sometimes they'll get in touch and say that they want more information or that they have some questions, or sometimes they might say they want to feature you for something and they might organize a whole, photo shoot, and you never know where it could go. But we want to write it so that it's ready to go in the magazine, so that if they're on a deadline and they're printing tomorrow and they've got a space and your email comes in and they think, do you know what, let's just pop this in, then it's ready to go. So you want to make sure it's proofread. You want to make sure that it's well written in plain and simple English. It doesn't need to be fancy, that you've considered the person who's going to read it, so their audience, and that it's relevant and appropriate for them, and that it has this interesting story, and ideally tying it in to something topical or something relevant for that time of year that's going to be on people's minds. So it's quite a tall order, but it's easier than it sounds. Normally a press release is just a page or so long. Sometimes it's 2 pages, so you don't want to make it too long. And it's an article, so you want to write it in the third person. So if you're talking about your jewelry business, you might say, Jenny left her job in 2001 to start her own jewelry business and blah, 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 blah. So it doesn't sound like you're saying, I've done this or I've done that. So again, thinking about that, could they copy and paste that and just put it straight into a blog post? Could they put it straight into somewhere? If you are pitching for a feature, you might not write a press release, and you might just say, I've seen that you run this feature, like I did with that local magazine that had the business of the month. And I just say, I'd love to be interviewed, because I know that they have a set of interview questions that they'd like to send me. So there's a few different ways you can play it. But generally speaking, in order to get attention and build a relationship, you want to send out some press releases. You want to make sure that the title is nice and compelling. So again, thinking about almost like a newspaper title, what would the headline be? The headline is what moves us to read the whole article and what motivates us to read that. So make sure that the headline has some juicy things in there. Don't use too much terminology, because generally speaking, the reader is not going to be someone who knows all the ins and outs of jewelry terminology. If you do use terminology in your article, you want to make sure that you explain it and that it's really simple and easy to read. So we want to go for simple language, enjoyable story, simple language. Not too long. Make sure it's got a start, a beginning, and an end. And at the bottom, put in all your web links or anything that you want to be included, and make sure that it links back to your business, because the whole point of this is to be able to have people come find you. And it's brilliant if they share these things online and they put a link in it, because that is really going to help with your SEO, having high authority links to your website. So that's really the process. And then once you've sent the press release, and don't have too high expectation with these, they do get ignored a lot because they get hundreds of them, but you never know when something might just land. And this content is great. Like, you can share this content yourself if nobody else does. You can share it on your newsletter, in your blogs. You might have to adjust it a little bit for your own audience, but writing stuff about your business, writing interesting stories about your business, is never a waste of time, because you can use that in all over the place. The other thing, so number 5, which is kind of, you want to make sure once you've sent the press release, you leave it, and then you can do one follow-up. So perhaps a week or so later, you might do a follow-up and just say, oh, just checking if you got the email and if you'd be interested at all. No worries if not, something like that. And once you've followed up, if you get ignored, then we leave it, because we don't want to, kind of spam people, but we want to make sure that people are very busy. I know I get emails sometimes and I think, oh yeah, that would be good. And then life gets in the way, a million more emails come through, we don't get round to it. So follow-ups are good, they are appropriate, but short and sweet. And then we're sort of done. The only other thing I haven't really spoken about with the press release, which is really important, are your images. So you want to make sure that you have high quality, high res images for print if you are approaching any kind of printed material. And for blogs, it doesn't need to be such high res, but high quality, crisp, beautiful, enticing images. That's going to make or break your story in many cases. So you want to make sure you include those or put a link to where people can download them. You don't want huge files in the first email you send. So often you might send lower res emails, but showing the visual and say, click here for the high res version and have a download link, or you can say, drop me an email for the high res version, I'll send it right over. So you want to make sure that you've got your images sorted. And for product images, they often like a mixture of lifestyle, sometimes on a white background, so that they can merge it in with other jewelry or pieces if they're doing kind of like a collage. And almost always they're going to want a picture of you, maybe at the bench or teaching a class or whatever it is that you're doing. So make sure you've got relevant images to the pitch, to the press release that you are sending out. Another really nice thing to do, and this is more of a sideline than following this path, this trajectory that we've been on, is to invite these people to come and do a class with you if you teach a class, or to give them a piece of jewelry. So this is a little bit more of an investment. If you're teaching classes, it's not much to ask a blogger or a YouTuber or a journalist to come to a class. We used to do this at London Jewellery School. We'd invite people to come, and we'd always say there's no pressure or obligation to write about the classes. But of course they did, because they were fun and it was interesting content for them and they would share it. So that's a really nice way to approach people as well. If you don't particularly have a press release or anything specific to share and you just want them to come and experience what you have to experience. But if you're a jeweler, perhaps you have a pop-up shop and you want to invite people along to that. A few times I've worked with jewelers and they have sent something very personal to a celebrity or someone who they really would like to get shared by in some way. And I don't recommend doing this a lot. So I don't recommend sending out all your jewelry to everyone you know, because it's a big cost and you're not going to get it back. But for example, having a think about something that they really like. So there was a celebrity who was really into cycling, and this jeweler sent her like a cycle necklace that she'd pierced out with a really nice handwritten card that just said, absolutely love what you're doing. Here's a little kind of gift for you. And if you want to find out more about my jewelry business, here it is. And of course, if you'd like to share, that will be awesome, but totally no pressure to. So just little things like that you can experiment with. They are experiments. They do cost money because you're creating something for free and they don't necessarily bear fruit. So you have to be at the stage in your business where you're able to and willing to experiment with these ideas, but they can be really lovely. And that jeweler got shared, and it was awesome for her. So it really helped to give a little spike. And that's the other thing with press, is it often gives spikes as opposed to building long-term audiences. But the other thing that I think it does, so a spike is nice, there's nothing wrong with a spike, but we need to remember that it's not, a long-term strategy. But what press does for your long-term strategy is build your credibility. And again, you can start saying as featured in on your website, all those kind of things. So it does definitely give kudos to your business. And I think probably what it does more than anything is build your confidence as a business owner and help you take yourself more seriously so that you're ready to move on to the next stage of growth. So we could talk about this all day, but I feel like that's enough for us to get started on. Hopefully you will have a go whenever is right for you and your business with some press strategies. And I wish you the best of luck with them. Keep strong. It's okay if people say no, keep going at it. And like I said, once you get one door open with this, it leads to others. So be a little bit patient and have it going in the background so that it's a nice addition to your marketing and your business. Wonderful. Thank you guys so much for joining me today. I look forward to seeing you next week on next week's episode. And until then, bye for now.